Battle not with monsters, lest you become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. It's a quote from Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. And it will kickstart my review of the 6th issue of Watchmen. Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons. As you can see here, and we talked about Watchmen on just the vlog that I put on the extended Shadow Gallery last night, and this here, that was the much newer book. This is the much older book. This is my first print of the first printing of the Watchmen trade paperback, graphic novel, whatever you want to call it. So it even has no back, so I've had this since 1987. We're going to talk a little bit about its history as far as the book itself is concerned, and my attachment to this series, and then we'll go into the book itself. Now, when I was, so 1987, I was 12 or 13 years old, and I was at the mall with my mother. And my mother, what I usually like to do was I like to go into Walden Books, which, if you're not familiar, is a bookstore, was a bookstore anyway in the United States. It was in business for a good while until it went out of business relatively recently. And basically, I always like to peruse the comics section. And I looked up there and I saw, this spine. I'm like, ooh, what's this? And I pulled it out and I see, okay, well, what's this? I've never heard of this. What is it? Because, being 12 or 13 years old, I'd only ever read mainstream titles. And so I started looking through it, and it had a lot of blood. It had boobs. It had harsh language. I'm like, ooh, okay, this is maybe kind of like one of those, after dark movies on Cinemax, kind of taboo. So I asked my mom if I could have this. It's $14.95. And since this was a comic book, she said sure, because she liked that I liked reading comic books. And so then I started taking it home, and pretty much since 1987, I probably read this book a few hundred times. One of the great things about Watchmen, and there are so many great things, is that you almost always get something new out of it when you're reading it. Now, here again, this is chapter 6, The Abyss Gazes also. And this essentially, as the format has gone on, is that each even-numbered issue is a character study. And this, of course, is delving into the character of Rorschach. Now, Rorschach isn't necessarily my favorite character of the Watchmen, but he's definitely the most distinctive voice and most often heard voice. My favorite character is actually Night Owl, but what's so special about Rorschach, like I said, is not only is he the primary voice you hear as far as the narrative structure is concerned, but he's the one that seems the least likely identifiable, yet we end up identifying with him. So basically here, as we found out in the last issue, he's been caught by the police and he's been put in prison. What we start out with here is Dr. Malcolm Long. And he's an African-American, kind of fat, very wealthy, kind of a Park Avenue, Central Park West type of psychiatrist. And he has been brought in or has either requested to do the interview, the psychological evaluation of Rorschach, who we find out now his name is Walter Kovacs. And it's the same man who's carrying around the end is nigh sign, as we've seen in the other issues. And he talks about him, and he talks, he says, the doctor in his notes says things like, a success here could make my reputation. And how he's very withdrawn, and physically he's fascinatingly ugly, actually. I could stare at him for hours, but except the fact that he stares back. And so basically what we have here is that Rorschach, Kovacs, he's looking at the Rorschach blots. And what he sees in his own mind's eye is never what he actually sees on the page here. But, of course, Dr. Long thinks that this is a sign of progress, because he said, he'll see things like a dog's head split in half, and he'll say that it's a pretty butterfly. And then we basically see his, we see glimpses into his past. We see that his mother was a prostitute, and she was very physically abusive with him. And now this is, and he sees that again in his mind's eye. He goes back to this memory of him as a child and being beaten. But as far as what he sees in the blot, what he says he says some nice flowers. Now, as they're taking him back to his cell. Now this is Rorschach, mind you. And he's in prison. And he's put a lot of people in prison, or a lot of brothers or fathers, what have you. He's killed a lot of them. And so all the way back to his cell, it's just threats and threats and insults and just everything. And that triggers another memory when he's back in his cell of when he was a young man and he was just trying to get some groceries from the store. And these two kind of juvenile delinquents, these, whatever, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, little douchebags, they confront him, and they, call his mother a whore, and, call him whore son, and, she asks if she's got any diseases, wonder if he's got any diseases, and they put, one of them smoking, and, one of the kids puts this, like a plum or something like that out, smashes it into his face. And so little Walter takes the cigarette out of the kid's mouth and puts it out in his eye. He starts attacking the other one. And that was when he was 10 years old. And then we see back to Malcolm Long. He's at home. He, has a very lovely wife. They're very upper class. And then we go back to, I guess, really kind of the next section with Dr. Long. And it says, "I'd like to talk about Rorschach. Will you do that for me, Walter? Will you talk about Rorschach?" And Walter simply replies, "You keep calling me Rorschach. I don't like you." And says, "Why is that exactly?" He says, "Fat, wealthy, think you understand pain. I'll tell you something, Doctor. I'll tell you about Rorschach." And basically, he starts telling him about when he was 16 years old. He left the children's home that he was put in after his mother died, or not after his mother just essentially kind of gave him away. And he is put in the shop. Now this is 1956, so Dr. Manhattan has already made his appearance public. And they made this Dr. Manhattan spin-off fabric that is basically this kind of this viscous fluid between two layers of latex. And so it's constantly blending and forming into different shapes, kind of like this never-ending Rorschach blot. And it says, "Customer, young girl, Italian name, never collected order, said dress look ugly." And Walter thinks that it's very beautiful. Then he takes it home, says nobody picked it up. So then 2 years go by. So I'm sorry, this is 1962. So it was 1956 that he started working in the factory. It was 1962 when this order started. So 1964, he was reading the paper, and there's the girl's name, the Italian girl's name, Kitty Genovese. Now, those of you who are not Americans might not know the story of Kitty Genovese, which is basically that she was a young woman in New York who was raped, tortured, cut up, killed, all right outside of her apartment building. And nobody called for help, and some of them even watched. Now, this is truth. This is something that really happened. So basically, at that point, he says, "I knew then what people were. Behind all of the evasions, all the self-deception. Ashamed for humanity, I went home. I took the remains of her unwanted dress and made a face that I could bear to look at in the mirror. Now, basically, then what we have happen here is that Rorschach is almost shivved in the cafeteria line. He takes a pan from the cafeteria filled with hot cooking fat and throws it into the other prisoner's face that's about to kill him. And so he has, horrific burns covering a pretty good degree of his body. But then at that point in time, this is from Dr. Long's notes. He said, none of you Rorschach says to the other inmates, you don't understand. I'm not locked up in here with you. You're locked up in here with me. And so basically there's some more interplay with the wife, and he goes into more detail about the fact that he wasn't Rorschach at the beginning. He was still just Kovacs. He was going around with his friends like Night Owl, and he said he was soft on scum. He mollycoddled them by letting them live. And and then he met the comedian for the first time in '66, and said, this is a man that I can really look up to as far as a costumed hero. He's uncompromising, he tells the uncomfortable truths, he's no bullshit, and it's obviously not what he says, but he's just, things everybody knows in gut, things everyone too scared to face, too polite to talk about. And he never surrenders, and he understands about society. And then Rorschach also says, as far as the whole Keene Act and things like that, we do not do this thing because it is permitted. We do it because we have to. We do it because we are compelled. And then we have the next session, and basically Long tells him, I think you've been holding back. Look at the Rorschach blots again and tell me what you see. And then he actually tells him about the dead dog with its head split in half. And Dr. Long asks him, well, what split the dog's head in half? And Rorschach simply replies, I did. And then he goes into basically his last, his last case as Kovacs being Rorschach. Because it's, there was a child that had been abducted, a little girl, 6 years old, and she was kidnapped. She was believed to be the heir to a fortune, but she was just it was a mistaken identity. It was just the daughter of some bus driver. So the abductor has these two, when he gets the information after, punching the crap out of people, he finally finds the kidnapper's home, and there are two dogs fighting over a bone, two German shepherds. And he goes into the house, he looks around, and finds a furnace. The furnace has the tattered, burnt remains of, appears to be a child's underwear. And then he finds a cabinet full of very, very precise, very, very well kept knives, cleavers, things like that. And then he notices the bone again that the dogs are fighting over, and he realizes that it's a human bone. And then he went to the dog and with the cleaver and just right in half. Same thing as the other dog. And then he basically, in this kind of almost kind of Mad Max kind of way, when he waits for the kidnapper to return to the home, starts tossing the dead dogs at him, and this whole time he's basically feigning his innocence. And then he says that he's going to kind of turn himself in, or not even so much that, but it's like, I haven't done anything. You think I have something to do with that little girl? Rorschach's not saying a thing the whole time, and then basically he handcuffs the kidnapper to a pipe and then gives him a hacksaw. And then he starts spilling kerosene along the floor. Then, you know, basically tells him, shouldn't bother trying to saw through handcuffs. Won't make it in time. And he lights a match, drops it, and lets him burn. And at an earlier point, after he's killed the dogs, basically, it was then that Kovacs closed his eyes and said, "Mother." It was Rorschach that opened them up again. And basically, he watches the fire, he watches everything burn, he imagines it in his own head, what is actually happening inside. And, says, this rudderless world is not shaped by vague metaphysical forces. It is not God that kills the children, not fate that butchers them, or destiny that feeds them to the dogs. It's us. Only us. And then, well, the Long and his wife, they have, in an effort to trying to make things a little bit more pleasant for the both of them because they're going through a rough patch, is that they have a couple of friends over for dinner, and they ask, hey, you're interviewing that Rorschach guy, right? Has he told you anything weird or kinky yet? And then basically he says, yes, he has. And he told me about a girl who got kidnapped. And they're starting to sound excited. Ooh, was she all like bound up and gagged and helpless? And he says no, she was 6. Her abductor killed her, butchered her, and fed her to his German shepherds. This, of course, shuts the dinner party down pretty quick. And his wife leaves him, and then he's left there staring at the same Rorschach blot where Kovacs Rorschach saw the dead dog. And he wanted to imagine what it looked like, but what he kept seeing, as he says, it looked more like the dead cat I once found, the fat, glistening grubs writhing blindly, squirming over each other, frantically tunneling away from the light. But even that is avoiding the real horror. The horror is this. In the end, it is simply a picture of empty, meaningless blackness. We are alone. There is nothing else. So essentially, and that's the issue. Essentially, we're dealing with not only the most nihilistic character, but easily the most nihilistic of the issues. This is my favorite issue it's because not only is, because we have, of course, we have the 9, we have the consistency of the, the 9-page, the 9-grid layout of Gibbons's framing of each page for the most part. And then we have this incredible character study that does some really remarkable things with this character. We get to see more inside, and this is ultimately the issue that helps us to identify with someone who almost has kind of almost neo-fascist ideas about the world. And basically, I mean, things that we in kind of this postmodern world would kind of sneer at. I mean, he's suspecting Veidt of being homosexual, and kind of calling rape was a moral lapse, things like that, and basically how he treats his own friends. I mean, this is the least empathetic guy in the book, with the exception maybe of Dr. Manhattan. But there's similarity there, because Rorschach, he does care in some way about the world and about truth. But ultimately, especially with the threat of war hanging over them constantly, what they're seeing is kind of an ultimate nothingness, an ultimate blackness, and that's what, between these two, it's really a character study of both of them, and how one changes the other, and not the other way around. And it is like this is absolutely, the whole book itself is a masterclass in storytelling. But this issue, I think, is a prime example of how well a comic book with very little action, I mean, there's really no action at all in this book. There's suspense, and there's horror, and there's darkness, but there's no, big fights or anything like that. Not what you would expect from a comic book. Watchmen means a lot to me personally because of that first kind of flirtation with this book, because I had no idea what it was about. I just thought, it looks like there are people getting laid inside the book. It looks like, well, there's tits. Ooh, well, there's a lot of blood there. Ooh, there's a lot of, people saying swear words. It's like, to a 12 or 13-year-old, this is like, wow, man, I gotta get my hands on this. And then, of course, I open it up and I really read it, or I try, when I was 13, I didn't get this book. It took me a couple years to really start to understand it. And that was only after reading it several times. And that's the great thing about this book, is that you will appreciate it for everything, how it looks and how it does read initially, but the more you read it, the more stuff you're going to get out of it. And so, of course, as a postscript to the issue, there's more of the kind of prose work, but instead of prose, what we have here is we actually have the police report of Rorschach being brought in. That we have, that information here, and exactly what he's being charged with for the most part, and some kind of little clues here as far as some stuff that might come up later. So why it's very important to read this, to read this information. It's just some information that, 5 individually wrapped sugar cubes, sweet chariot chewing sugar. So that's an important part that comes in later. And then we have some information from, the New York State Psychiatric Hospital. And basically, we have, the information about why Walter has been put into the psychiatric hospital. There's a lot of information here, and it's basically a write-up of his life. It's kind of a preliminary report on everything that kind of led to him becoming Rorschach. And then we have this really nice little homage here. See that? It says the Charlton home. And this is basically where it's a letter. It's basically this is the home that Walter was at throughout most of his youth. And he even has a drawing here of the dream that he sees. And it's really, and it's a similar thing to what we've just seen, to what we saw at the beginning of the book, with what he sees in the silhouettes of his mother and the John having sex. It's a very difficult book to read because of its themes, because of its construction, because of the way that it does ultimately hold up not just a mirror to the superheroes that do exist in the world, because obviously, I mean, the learned, I guess, those of us comic geeks, we recognize, okay, well, Dr. Manhattan is supposed to be Captain Atom, Night Owl is supposed to be Blue Beetle, Rorschach is supposed to be the Question. But when the public looks at this, they see Batman is Night Owl and Superman is Dr. Manhattan. As far as the other characters, well, they don't really know what the hell's going on, who they could possibly be. So in this, so So in the populist ideas, because nobody knows who Captain Atom or Blue Beetle or the Question are, unless they're people that read comics. So I mean, basically, when they see this, they see a Batman who can't get it up, and a Superman who apparently doesn't give a shit about anybody or anything. So I mean, it's, again, as I said in the video from last night, this is a real game. You know, this book itself was a real game changer, coming out the same year as Dark Knight Returns. But this issue, more than anything, it speaks to the levels at which this book goes to explore not only the character but the world around him. And it doesn't just give us a very kind of trite, cliched story, but at the same time it kind of does. You know, abused as a child, grew up alone, you know, feels very isolated, very lonely, you know, constantly being insulted. He's, you know, but, you know, and now he becomes a mass vigilante, and, you know, first was punching the crap out of people, and now it's just straight up killing them. So, it works with the trope of that, and it turns it into something much darker. And we're seeing somebody who is who is not a costumed hero, but somebody who is legitimately a psychopath. But at the same time, from this issue, we get to understand that psychopath a little bit better. And that's ultimately what makes the Abyss Gazes also work so brilliantly. So, that's it for this review of issue 6 of Watchmen. Please tune in for the other ones, and if you haven't seen the other ones so far, please continue watching them. Congratulations to everybody who's already done videos. They've been spectacular, and I hope that you enjoy this one even just a little bit of what the other ones have done. So I know that I said last night that I filmed this one last week. I did, and I accidentally erased it, which is why I had to do it over here. So I'm going to do a quick video, put it on the Shadow Gallery page, and then put the link to this extended review on that video. So please tune in. Okay? Well, if you're already here, then great. If you're not, then I'll still give you the link anyway in the shorter one. So, Watchmen, issue 6. This is James Donnelly from the Shadow Gallery, reminding you to stay in the shadows.